I'd like to read first just a few lines of a poem by Adrienne Rich, who was an American feminist poet. It's just 6 lines. My heart is moved by all I cannot save. So much has been destroyed. I have to cast my lot with those who, age after age, perversely, with no extraordinary power, reconstitute the world. That was published in 1977. It's from a poem called Natural Resources. And when I discovered it quite a few years ago, I found it very moving. I think it's a timeless evocation of some of the deep motivations behind our desire to change the world. And about 10 years ago, I wrote out those lines on a nice piece of paper with quite a nice pen. And I pinned them to the notice board in the kitchen of the office of the campaign group I worked for. That was my job. It was a professional campaign group. And our job was looking at natural resources too. We were investigating the links between natural resource extraction and conflict and corruption. We were looking at blood diamonds and how oil fuels kleptocracy and creates poverty in many of the countries where it's extracted. We were looking at illegal logging and the destruction of ecosystems and people's homes, looking at what happens to people who try to defend their land. And that work felt very important to me. I'd been working on the arms trade before that, and I wanted to get sort of deeper into the kind of causes of conflict. And natural resources and extraction seemed to be it, and I could focus on the role of companies that were incorporated where I lived. It felt like a good way to try and bring change. And so there I was in my cramped office in Holborn, sort of surrounded by piles of stuff and buzz and people, or I was whizzing about on the Eurostar or flights to Washington or New York to shout at bankers and the United Nations or the OECD or the IMF or the World Bank or whatever it was. And we were trying to get new laws, we were trying to get treaties, we were trying to get policies changed. A lot of the time it didn't work, and sometimes it did. I can reasonably claim I've been involved in campaigns for treaties that did happen, and new laws that we did create. I was so busy though, I didn't see the extraction that we were involved in. We were involved in extraction of ourselves and each other through working so hard without a break. We were involved in extraction from the people who we thought we were trying to help through assuming that voice and funding and work were ours to be doing on behalf of anyone else. I didn't notice those bits at the time, but what I did notice is a growing feeling of something missing in myself and in our own efforts. It felt like there was a sort of a desiccation, a kind of dissonance. And the only way I could describe it at the time felt like this rather sort of nebulous word that kept arising of what was missing, and it was soul. That's what it felt like, and I couldn't sort of describe it any deeper at that point. So recently I read Mina's really fantastic essay, A Feminist Analysis of the Soul, which I heartily commend to you. And in the time that we've got, there's no reason to deviate from your excellent structuring of thinking about soul and what it is, to apply to what was going on here. You talked about beauty and depth and meaning and inner experience, about our sense of the ineffable and intangible, and about soul as our true nature, who we really are, each of us, not as individuals in a culture that tells us we're separate, but in the way that Jonathan was talking about, our unique essence that makes us. And in all of these meanings, something about attention to soul was missing in the campaigning that we were doing, in the meaning of the work and why we were doing it, in how it connected to what we really were, in what we were bringing of ourselves. And 3 simultaneous developments around that time started to kind of enlarge my sense of what was missing. One of them was noticing one of the ways in which we were replicating, recreating, reusing the system that we thought we wanted to change. Now, that's essentially what the Entangled activist is about. It's what I've ended up writing about. The first one I really noticed in my work was our tendency to as kind of professional policy campaigners to use the same assumptions of a rational actor that underpin the homo economicus type of economics we were trying to, whose effects we were trying to undo. We were using that in our own tactics. We were putting our carefully sourced and libel-checked facts in front of policymakers and expecting them to respond on a rational basis. Of course they didn't. This was a few years before the 2016 elections of Trump and for Brexit that started to reveal sort of more consistently to more people the limitations of that kind of thinking. I mean, actually, I think the left and progressives are often the last to get there on realising this. The advertisers have been doing it for decades. The right's been doing it for decades. Populists use it, you know, and there we were, kind of still relying on being right, being correct, getting the facts out, instead of thinking about how we might appeal to our targets' inner motivations, their souls, in effect. Another thing that was happening around that time was that in order to equalise this pressure I felt of the work during the week, I was running away at the weekends. I was running west and northwest to the mountains and to the moors to walk and swim in rivers and rock climb and camp. And I was noticing that I was a different self in the wild. The weeks I was this kind of, you know, hurling myself around the place, kind of thinking, arguing sort of self that was necessary in order to process the kind of libel risk I was responsible for, or source protection. It was, you know, there was serious stuff. But in the wild and the green places at the weekends, I noticed I was this soft, bodily, porous, expansive, mossy self. And it felt such an extraordinary contrast. I was delighting in soft river water as I swam, and in sort of hard edges of rock as I sort of was swearing my way up a tough rock climb, and in this sort of wonderful kind of sort of expanded soft perception that you get after a whole day of walking along a high mountain ridge in the quiet. And I was realising that the boundary between myself and the natural world was not as firm as I thought. I was breaking down that sort of binary a bit. I was sort of reuniting with the nature that was outside of me, but also the nature within me. And I was realising the difference, this profound difference between the restricted state of consciousness that I brought to work and the sort of more expanded sense of consciousness that I had when I was in the wild. And the difference between the two, again, was soul. Soul was what I could experience more fully in myself when I wasn't forcing my mind to perform only its rational, instrumental operations. And after the conversation about beauty yesterday, I now realise that we could probably, in some of these situations, just sort of substitute beauty for soul in these situations, sort of beauty in its kind of broadest meaning there. The third thing that was happening around that time was as a development of this expanded sort of deep ecological consciousness I was experiencing. And by deep ecological consciousness, I suppose I mean sort of expanding my sense of self, not just to my own soul that was beyond my kind of controlling ego, but the sort of wider kind of ecological soul and our connection with kind of human and non-human beings, with the wider matrix of life. So what I realised in doing that was that my work was not going to be enough to reach the level of the situation that Jonathan's just outlined. And 10 years ago, I think that the language of ecological grief wasn't so developed then. I felt like I was sort of stumbling around on my own and without support. And I eventually found ways to hold that grief through Joanna Macy's work that reconnects, and practitioners of that who were holding grief rituals and circles. So I used ritual to try and support it. But I was realising the work I was doing, it wasn't going to do it. There was no species or peoples who would be immune to this relentless drive to extract, and that what we were doing was trying to make the damage caused by extractive capitalism a bit less bad. We were trying to reform it here, put some restraints in here, stop people behaving quite so outrageously. And that wasn't going to do it. And of course there is such a thing as movement ecology. There's, you know, no campaigner can do everything. Of course there are bits of it, but personally the dissonance between what I was arguing for, regulate this, regulate that, sort of within that system, and what I was now aware of what might be necessary, became too much. And it was at that time I pinned those Adrian Rich lines to the notice board. it was like a tiny cry, a tiny pathetic cry of my soul for some attention to what was being felt. And there were a few other people at work who I sort of tried to gather, and I tried to sort of hold a bit of space for us to think about that, and I didn't do a very good job. I didn't manage it. It was hard enough to articulate what it was that mattered in itself. It was exponentially harder in the context of that office and that workplace and our work, because it looked like we had to argue for it against the great pressure of practicality of, well, we've got to do this, we've got to do that, there's that briefing. It sank, and other things got pinned over the poem on the notice board, and I really felt that. So I'm talking today about the place of soul in our attempts to change the world. And so I've described, how I came to understand that soul was missing in my approach to changing the world. But I suppose we should look at why it matters. Like, does it matter? Does this go beyond campaigners keeping themselves sane and avoiding burnout? Like, does it matter for everyone else? I think it does. I think there's a relationship between the inquiry I've been on the last few years about the place of soul in our attempts to change the world and the broader inquiry that we're in here today about the place of soul in a troubled world. And those, look, we've got two concepts there. There's a troubled world and there's our attempts to change the world. Now, for some people, I'm one of them, the relationship between those two things is quite direct and obvious, or it has been for a long time. It was for a long time for me and a lot of the people I've worked with. We perceive a troubled world. Well, we're going to go and do something about it. We're going to crack on. Let's get into action. We're going to sort it out. So, yeah, my name's Anthea. I'm an activist. And I think activism does matter. I heard, I've had a number of conversations with Bio, and I've studied with him, and when he says, we are stuck, we've known about climate change for decades and so on, it's like, well, yes, that's true. I'm not disputing that, but also, I want to talk about power. I want to talk about the billionaire press, a small number of people whose power is completely warping the majority of people's understanding of this. I want to talk about the fossil fuel lobby. We have to differentiate the we, the real power that is influencing how a lot of people see this. The we that is people empowered potentially to take action, the we of people who are already being affected profoundly in different places in the world by what's going on with climate change and climate injustice. So like the context of what I'm saying is that I think activism does matter for those reasons. People power, when we're up against those forms of power, are definitely part of the picture. But also, I have to acknowledge there are a lot of people who don't think like me, for whom there is no easy following on from the perception and observation of a troubled world to moving into action to do something about it. And so that's why I want to think about the place of soul in our attempts to change the world in that context, because I think it is relevant more broadly. Now, from different perspectives, there are a number of reasons, there are many reasons why people might not want to move straight or might not see the direct link to moving into changing the world. So the sociologists who study social movements might look at, what kind of movements are available? What can you join? Are there things you can do? How are they recruiting people? How are they attracting people? The climate psychologists might look at the values action gap, this yawning gulf between our absorption of disturbing facts about the world and our realisation of our agency to do something about it. And some of them are concluding, well, there isn't really a gap at all. It's filled with a tangle of confusion and fears and unconscious stuff that needs attending to. The political psychologists might look at different personality types and family histories and your family political disposition and how that might relate to your likelihood of adopting an oppositional stance against the status quo. The social psychologists might look at the drawing of distinctions between in and out groups and the kind of dynamics that arise when activists kind of go into action. My own research I wanted to look at the sort of deep psychoanalytic kind of consequences of what's going on there. I'm quite interested in the projections of our own stuff that is going on across that line that is drawn whenever an activist acts. the activists projecting onto the people they're talking about or to, and vice versa, the projections that get put onto activists. So all of that is to say that this question of looking at the missing soul in campaigning needs to take account of all of those reasons for perhaps not wanting to consider oneself an activist. So sometime after leaving that job, I eventually had to leave. I couldn't carry on with that level of dissonance. I began with Perspectiva an inquiry into the inner life of activism. And I talked to other activists, people doing similar work to me and people who'd done very different work. I read kind of widely and quite deeply into writing about activism, into psychology, into psychoanalytic thinking, decolonial thinking. And also I reevaluated what I had previously thought about what I was doing. I reevaluated my own experiences in the light of what I was learning. And one of the questions that helped frame that inquiry was this perennial question of activism from the outside, which is, why the hypocrisy? Why are you doing, somebody said it yesterday in no uncertain terms, why are you doing, it was you, wasn't it? Why are you doing the thing that you say that you don't want? Why would you do that? Why would you do this such obvious thing that undermines you? And that criticism is often used from the outside. It's often used by those who might have a vested interest in not wanting to agree with what the campaigners are saying as a way of making it go away. It's a kind of counter-reaction by those with interest to defend. But actually, I think there's a much more compassionate answer to that question of why activists are doing the opposite of what they're asking people to do, which is that we're entangled, and that's why I chose this title, we're entangled in the problems that we're trying to change. They run through us too. This is why we end up with people who are advocating for human rights, yet who are fundamentally denying the humanity of the people that they're talking about. It's why we end up burning ourselves out whilst trying to stop an endless growth economy from burning out the planet. It's perhaps one of the deep roots behind this extraordinary and disturbing sequence of stories coming out of the UK's funded charity sector at the moment, of like one organisation after another with scandals with abuse and harassment of discrimination within their own staff. Oppressive and abusive interpersonal dynamics are manifestations of an underlying way of relating and seeing to others that is ultimately rooted in dominance and constructed hierarchies. And that's what underpins the social and economic systems and political systems that we're trying to change. And so inevitably, those same dynamics arise in the people who are trying to change them. We can't be separate from what we're trying to change when we're up against a culture that hasn't just created the laws and policies we want to change, it's shaped our very perceptions about who we are and our ways of being with each other. And that is a really tough and counterintuitive admission for the campaigners, because we base our understanding of what we're doing on, right, well, we're out to get, I mean, the way I see it is we're getting the bastards, we're getting those bastards over there, we're getting them. Problems running in us, we're the good ones, we're not doing that. And so to come back to that first entanglement that I'd noticed when I was still doing that work, this kind of my noticing that we were doing rational arguing, using only that bit of ourselves, expecting our audience to respond in a rational way, all this to undo the results of a system built only on what can be measured and analysed and reasoned. Yeah, I mean, it seemed completely ridiculous. But applying an entanglement frame, I think it's not quite so surprising. We're living in a cultural, social, philosophical context that has prioritised reason over other ways of knowing, and in all manner of explicit and implicit ways has told us that soul matters less than the outputs of our thinking. It's created what Ken Wilber calls a kind of flatland. And so it's ultimately not that surprising in those terms that we're doing change based on the same kind of structure, kind of minus our souls, basically. And of course, our likelihood of seeing this does depend on our starting point. If we've not had reason in our own lives to so much question the dominant culture, if we've not run into lots of structural impediments ourselves in doing what we want to do, then we are less likely to have asked those questions, which is why campaigning efforts that have emerged more consistently from people's own lived experience of the problem have been more open to looking at the inner and soulful aspects of campaigning, because they're more likely to have had to do so, whether it's to cope and live and transcend the trauma that comes from living in an oppressive culture, or to reclaim the agency that might be necessary in order to speak out. And I learned through this process the ways in which my own privilege and the ways in which I had gone into activism in order to help had blocked me from being able to see some of these entanglements. Now, what does it look like to allow for our inner lives when we're thinking about changing the world? I think it looks like acknowledging our grief and our anger and finding ways to harness them, perhaps not in their full, really bright, first lit burning flame, but in a kind of burnt down way, so they can really fuel our campaigning and our motivation for action. I think it looks like doing our own shadow work, so we're not projecting the lost and suppressed aspects of ourselves onto the other side. I think it looks like a recognition that whatever we're doing to change the world is as important as the what. It's not instead of. Sometimes people get kind of reactive to that. It's doing them both. It's doing them both together. I also think it's about giving space for meaning. And I'll give an example of this. So the kind of funded organisations that I was working in, we have to justify to our funders why we are spending their money on certain activities and prioritising certain things and not others. That means you end up doing a sort of cost-benefit calculation and analysis of what might work. And of course that's necessary. Of course you have to justify to your funder. I'm smiling at the person from a funding organisation in the room. And of course from the funder's perspective they have to do it as well. Like, there's really obvious reasons for it, but I think it has consequences. These kind of analyses can fail in the face of complexity thinking, and that's something that the funding sector is trying to grapple with at the moment, because they're assuming a linear cascade of consequences. But in the terms of what we're talking about here, I think they fail as a motivator because those kind of calculations don't take account of the meaning of playing our part in a troubled world. And I really felt this when I walked out onto Waterloo Bridge in the first big Extinction Rebellion action, and sat down in the middle of the road, which was completely terrifying. And after years of planning frameworks and justifying my activities to funders and writing long reports to them, it felt really liberating to sit down in that road and not to know if my part in what I was doing was going to make a difference. Indeed, it took the pressure off me. This wasn't about me trying to justify what I was going to do. It wasn't about my attachment to my ideas of success. I was participating in something bigger than myself. I was harnessing my grief. I was taking part in something emergent. After years of using lawful methods and making no headway on, frankly, lesser questions, it felt like I was doing something necessarily bold in the face of the enormity of what we were doing. And it's true, there is a line to tread here. Look, the far-right populists, indeed our own Conservative government in their confecting of a culture war for their own electoral purposes, they are all harnessing fear and anger and emotion as well in ways that are very disturbing. I'm not talking about doing the same thing. I'm not talking about doing a sort of baby and bathwater manoeuvre of sort of like throwing out our reasoning and going for pure emotion. And actually, of course, I'd thought about it before I sat down on that bridge. Of course, I'd been to lots of XR meetings, I'd talked to the founders, I'd thought about their theory of change. What I'm talking about here, though, it's a liberation from our attachment to having to know the outcome. It's a liberation from our own desire to know that, or to think that we can only engage if we've kind of like done some kind of calculation and we think it's worth it. And this is where I think this might be maybe, I'll be interested in your responses, relevant for people who haven't seen themselves as campaigners. Because a lot of the people I spoke to, one of the many reasons that they talked about for not wanting to be a campaigner, those of them who weren't, because I talked to people who weren't campaigners as well, and it was because I don't know if I'm going to make a difference. So in these terms, when we can kind of attend to our own souls enough to kind of detach ourselves from having to be, you know, the saviour, or, you know, us having to win somehow, I wonder if it might liberate us to feel that we can act in different ways. And I think in this sense, bringing soul into it also brings a form of resilience. Amisha, I was really moved yesterday by what you were saying about beauty as resilience. And you spoke about beauty and connecting to the truth of who we are, if I understood it right, and still finding joy. And what I felt when you said that is that's what activism felt like to me when I was able to let go of that command and control and calculation thing about sort of where I had to sit in the sort of success of it all. I was also really struck when you said when we're living through beauty, we don't need to know all the answers. And what I thought then, sort of thinking about what I was going to say today, is, you know, I almost want to turn that round too. In this context, when we can let go of having to have the answers, which is effectively what I was doing in this kind of campaigning in a different way, the beauty is more available to us. And we can act from beauty in a way that just feels much easier. And some of these kind of obstacles move away. And so to me, the alternative to that kind of command and control and calculate form of thinking about how we engage in the world can be found in thinking about it as a practice. It's a way of living. It's not about just the destination. And in my experience, that's only possible when we attend to our own soul enough to understand why we were so attached to our sense of our place of ourselves in the destination. So in order to understand my selfish reasons for needing to feel like I was saving the world, I did have to go in and look at my own stuff a bit. I think this idea that we have to know it's worth it, that it has to be worth our intervention, holds a lot of people back. So I'm interested in the potential liberatory possibility of this. The final consequence I wanted to talk about of allowing, am I all right for time? Thanks, Mark. The final consequence of allowing for our souls in how we think about changing the world is about what happens when we acknowledge we're entangled. What happens when we acknowledge we're part of the problem? I mean, it sounds like, okay, well, that's a bit of a reframing. That sounds quite straightforward in some ways. But actually, I think there's a really substantive implication. I think one of our greatest entanglements is in an individualist culture that denies we're entangled. It's telling us we're separate. It's telling us, you know, it's insisting on our freedom to do as we please. So I think acknowledging that we're shaped by the context that we're in, acknowledging that our entanglement means we're radically, you know, in its meaning of at our roots, interconnected with everyone and everything else, human and non-human. I think it brings a really different starting point to how we think about changing the world. Acknowledging that we're shaped in interior ways by what we'd like to change changes how we have to speak about the problems. I can no longer do my thing of like, let's get the bastards. Because if we're entangled in the problem, then it isn't just the bastards. It's us too. It's a very different sort of tone to activism. It's not this kind of shouty, blamey, projecty thing that puts so many people off and that is so kind of soulfully sort of exhausting to the soul of those who are doing it. Also, I think the task of change being not just out there, but in us, means a much wider range of practices and ways of doing things differently count as activism. Because how we relate to each other, how our souls meet each other, changing how we do that becomes an integral part of how we understand changing the world. And then finally, I'm not sure we can even call it changing the world, because that very phrase, I mean, the grammar of it fascinates me. When we say, I am going to change the world, we are bringing in the subject-object thinking and division, this was talked about yesterday, that's at it's the very underpinning, arguably, of some of the problems we're talking about. It's hard to get away from that. It's funny, even if I've sort of like analysed and thought about it quite deeply, I still find myself when I'm talking using it as a shorthand. It's very, very baked in. But if we see it like that, then we're part of the world's part of us. And I think then we're just talking about taking action in a troubled world as part of that world. Thank you.